So my journey with Keyline started as a young fella. My grandfather's property just outside of Bendigo, which is now out of the family, was developed following Keyline principles on the water side of things. So, and it wasn't called that, as a lot of properties weren't, and that's part of the outcome of Yeoman's work in Australia, was that a lot of what he did actually pervaded normal practice without it being called Keyline per se. So the biggest thing that so the Keyline part of our farm was the water part. So we had a whole range of dams, which were all, or ponds as you would call them in the US, which were all interconnected. They harvested water off the landscape. We had a municipal, a civil race system. So water was delivered by open channel, which was about 3 or 4 foot across, and that water would come into our property as well. That was part of a sort of a grander scale system, like you have in parts of the US and other parts of the world, where you've got high level reservoirs and then open channels which deliver water. So we had that as well. But our property, the biggest dam was actually filled by off catchment, and then the water from that distributed water to all of the other dams, which were all as high as they could be in the landscape. And out of them, we did flood irrigation using small channels, which I operated as a child, and still to this day, I've got this. If there's flowing water in a little channel, then I immediately go back to being a child again, and I can't resist it. So that was my upbringing. The thing that Grandad didn't do at all was take care of the soil. So, when you look at the Keyline scale of permanence, climate, land shape, farm water, farm roads, farm trees, buildings, subdivision, and soils, the bits that he took care of in the Keyline part were really just the water. Everything else, we did a little bit of tree planting towards the end of his life, but it didn't follow the landscape lines that were sort of defined in a Keyline plan. So, and that's what a lot of people do. It's a natural, just as an aside, it's a natural tendency of people to pick and choose the bits that they want out of something, as opposed to do things in a whole system. And that's why, as teachers, we've got to be really careful or as promoters of concepts of systems, we've got to be really careful to keep reminding people that, to think like the system. Don't try and segment out all of the parts, so that that you're not doing Keyline if you just do a bit of subsoiling, or you're not doing Keyline if you're just putting in a few dams here and there. It's a whole system, and just like you're not doing permaculture if you're not following the ethics and the core principles. So or holistic management by just doing some grazing planning. There's a lot more to these things, and I think to honour the origination of them, it certainly is important to at least consider all of that in your development of your own whole. So that's where I started with all of that. In about 1987, I think it was, when I was about, it would have been, 1986, when I was 19, I think, 18, 19. One of my friends, the late Peter Crutchfield, he lent me a book called The One Straw Revolution. And at that stage, I'd not heard anything of permaculture or Keyline per se or anything like that, but I got right into that. It was a sort of a good book for the time, especially the do-nothing philosophy, although I took that on to mean something completely different to what Fukuoka-san was intending. But I was living at my grandparents at the time and on the farm, and I developed a beautiful, quite an outstanding garden. My nana had always had a great garden, and we had this, our homestead envelope was quite archetypal in the sense that When you look at it from a permaculture perspective, if you apply that lens of relative location, it did all of that really well, and each element supported many other elements. So, for example, we had a house dam. The highest dam on the property was right next to the homestead, and it was completely off limits to all swimming, all animals, everything. And it had you know how in permaculture or in a lot of landscape design, what people will do is put steps. They'll design the stepped profile on the edge of a dam where you can grow all your wetland species and everything. Well, my grandfather developed that back in the 50s. And so the whole dam was completely engulfed in this plant called Chilianthes, which is a brilliant water cleaner. And if we sat on the veranda, and he was an excellent shot. And if a cormorant went on there or a kangaroo, it got shot immediately. And then just below that was the pig shed. So he'd say, "Oh, Dazza, go and get that shag," which is what we call a cormorant, or go and get that roo, and go and feed it to the pigs. Go and take it to the pigs, Dazza. So you just get a complete disproportionate use of force by using a 303 to shoot this little bitty bird or from 100 yards, and bang, off I'd go, drop that down there. Now, when I talk about relative location, all of the yards of all of the animals where we confined our animals at night, for example, they were all put in on mulch and all of the rest of it. And then that material went to the next section, so you're radiating around from this circle. The water supply came from that dam. That water supply was also our drinking water for our house. So we used open dam water for our drinking water, as well as rainwater tanks, because it was so clean. Because of all of the plants in this strata system. Then we went from there so you had all of the confinement pens and a dairy and all the rest of it for the animals. All of the material which I or my cousins would clean up from where the animals were in confinement would then go into the large compost systems. And then from the composts, it would go into my nana's home garden. So we had this whole rotation, and then the garden had a fence around it which grew grapevines, and so that garden was always operated on fairly conventional principles by my nana. A lot of tillage, she'd compost it, and she didn't do any crop rotation or anything sophisticated like that. She just put compost in and manure every year and just did that. And she's not here to talk to me about it now, but I don't think she did any crop rotation per se. She may not have grown her potatoes in the same bed every year, but she didn't go through in any stepped process of going root and then legume and then . Anyway, I set up a big no dig, so I got all of this straw, all of the rest of it, and everything just exploded. And I think it was because for the first time the garden had been mulched, and all my uncles, who I've always had an interesting history with, they came around and saw this exploding garden, and it was basically following Fukuoka's principles of no dig, and it exploded, and it went, and they were just going, "What the hell have you done here? What's this? It's magical." And it was. And from that, it sort of built the genie of growing, and then sort of tried to spread that out. I did the seed balling thing with some alfalfa or lucerne because some of the farm dam walls were bare, so I thought I'll give the seed balling do, and that worked reasonably well with alfalfa, although I should have used grasses in retrospect. And there was just things like that from Fukuoka, and then I went away and worked in hospitality and travelled around Australia, and then I became a chef de rang, which is where you cook at the table, and doing flambeau, so you cook in a tuxedo. And I did that in Tasmania at an international hotel, and the executive chef was the youngest executive chef of an international hotel in Australia at the time, Brett Hansen. He was only 27 or 28, so quite young. And he was right into local food. So this is like 1988, I think, or 89, or something like that. Anyway, he was right into local food. So, and Tasmania was the birth of the world's first Green Party. Was the first organic farmers association. So all of these things, and then of course permaculture came from Tasmania. So there was all of the, and it all conspires. And we were right in the thick of that in a place called Launceston, which is a beautiful temperate climate, rich red basaltic soils all around. Never gets that hot, very mild climate, perfect place for horticulture. And so we had all of these producers coming in to us, and not just vegetables and fruits, but also meat producers. Launceston's on the end of an estuary, and so lots of shellfish and seafood and all of that. So they were all coming to us, and we're just all going, "This is amazing!" We were able to be incredibly we were using the great fresh organic biodynamic produce and seafood and all the rest of it. But 2, it was all local. And 3, all of the farmers themselves were relatively young and invigorated and innovative and all of that. So that was a very furtive time. And then from there, so that really sparked the local food, plus the linkage back to, the first linkage into the innovative farmers that are out there. And then after that, I got a job in Bendigo. I left hospitality and got a job in Bendigo working at the organic greengrocer, as it was called. And so I was a grocer for a couple of years, which was my last job, my last employment. And I managed that shop for a few years. And that was when things took on another level, because now I was a buyer. And so I was doing 2 things. One, I was basically the face of organic food in Bendigo. And 2, I'm in central Victoria, which is one of the epicenters of organic agriculture in the world, for similar reasons to why in Tasmania. Now, in that situation, what was going on was I was buying food. So I was going out to all of these producers who were the leaders. This is 30 years ago almost now. They were the leaders in all of this, and they were all saying to me, "What's so-and-so doing?" Right? And so you can see where this is going, Matt, that I started to be the person who was the interpreter or the interlocutor between different farmers who are saying, "Oh, what's Joe Blow doing up the road there with his carrots? How's he getting along? How many's he selling? How much are you buying them for?" All of this different stuff, which ostensibly I still do today, because people come to me and say, "How do you do this, that, and the other?" And I say, "Well, I know a bloke. I've got a client." I say that all the time. I've got a client who does this, and this might work with you. It's a different situation, but that's a lot of what. So in that journey, after I worked at the grocer, I just got more and more people who at the counter. So people who are coming and buying organic food, they are the people who want to have that little farm, and they say, "Oh, can you come out and help? You sound like you might be able to help us." Blah blah blah. And I grew up on a farm, so I knew how to do a few things, and that was helpful. And so I had those rural skills. And so before I left that job, I started to go and do that kind of work for people on the weekends and whatnot. And before too long, I opened up a consultancy, and I left. So we left. Our eldest daughter Isabella was 25 on the 6th of March, and I left my employment on that day. So as soon as she was born, I gave my resignation and started our business. So yeah. So then from there, we all carried on and when was that, March, and then later that year, I think it was in November, I did a PDC. So I was already doing farm design based on my own ideas and everything. And then I did PDC with Andrew Sheridan and Hugh Gravestein, and that was pretty cool. It was on a farm, and they were pretty practical kind of guys, and it was an old sort of, we were talking earlier about PDCs and how a lot of people don't think that they're very skills based, but some of these ones were. People did a pretty good job. They weren't PDCs in the Mollisonian fashion, because Mollison had, day to a chapter, that sort of thing, and that serves a purpose. But these ones were more about farm skills and growing skills and social skills and all of those sorts of things, which was really useful. And I did a farm plan at the end of that, and then that was already already done a number of those. Then soon after that, I think it was in the January of '94, I did a Keyline course with Vries Gravestein, Hugh's father, and the late Vries, and Alan Lehman, who is a Keyline contractor and an earth mover. That was in Albury, and that was pretty wild because the whole Keyline world, see, Yeomans has a really special place in Australia, and Keyline, a lot of, people don't realise how popular Yeomans was. I mean, he had there's nobody in permaculture or any of this space who had thousands of people come to their farm. I mean, you look at who are the biggest names in permaculture now, Lawton and a few other, Eric Olson and a few other characters out there. They don't have thousands of people come to their farm. They might get 50 or 20 or 30 and all that, but Yeomans had thousands come. And this was in the 1950s and 60s when, cars only went 50 miles an hour, and they had shit roads and they weren't very comfortable, so people went to a lot of effort and they took bus trips and all of that stuff. And Australia's a big country. It's the same size as the US. So people were travelling far and wide to come and see this bloke's stuff. And so when, with the Keyline brand, as even post Yeomans himself, you'd get all of these people. So the crowds that would come, and indeed to this particular program, the people who would come would be some of those who went to some of Yeomans things years ago because they were coming out of a sort of what's new in Keyline nostalgia sort of space, and then others who were new to it or relatively new to it and brought a lot of things to it. So some of those people we had, which was really inspirational. One was the Chief Forester of the Australian Capital Territory, which is the equivalent of the District of Columbia in the US. So our capital has a little state around it. And they have a lot of pine forests. And he was using Keyline pattern cultivation techniques for his pine forests. And he said that he was able to get pine trees to grow in an area that was about 8 inches less rainfall than it should be to grow pine trees because of the effectiveness of the Keyline pattern. And that was pretty important to me to hear. And I used that time and time again thereafter and proved that to be the case. There was another guy there who was a Shire engineer for the Shire of Melton, and really experienced, very conservative civil engineer. Well, they'd used Keyline to design their municipal water treatment plant. So he'd built all of these dams and done all this flood irrigation, and that flowed on from Yeomans' work in the 1960s and 70s when he was hired by a number of municipalities and to design their wastewater treatment plants because he knew how to, a lot of people don't know, but Yeomans back in the 50s had the biggest private dams in Australia. And he built dams that, see, most people up to then, people built dams in valleys. So, when you travel across the US, Matt, you'll see, or anywhere in the world, you'll see that people put ponds in valleys. Yeomans put dams in valleys, but made them much bigger than other people did. He put pipes in the bottom of them so that you could irrigate out of them, because he felt that if you didn't empty a dam at the end of the dry season, then it was a waste of capital, right? Because what's the point in building this structure if you don't use the water, right? If you just let it evaporate or seep.